Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us for today's IBM Tech Exchange webinar. I'd just like to go over a couple of housekeeping things before we begin. You should see a Q&A box towards the bottom of your screen where you can begin to submit any questions that you have for today's presenters. And later today, you'll be sent a link to the on-demand recording, a link to access the slides, and a link to the IBM Tech Exchange community where you can connect directly with our experts. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Marilyn Stewart.
Hello. Hello, everybody. My name is Muriel Vial. I'm working in the Devops Test for the IBM Devops Automation entity in IBM. And today I'm going to present the new functionality in Devops Test 2023.12 release. That is the newest data feature. But before that, I want to give a quick overview of Devops Test Hub, as it's our main capability where we are going to see all the new functionality on DevOps test arriving, and to make sure that everybody has the same understanding of the platform before we go into the technical details of the newest data feature. I propose myself to give an overview of the Test Hub, and then we'll jump into the new data fabrication with a demonstration that Stuart is going to give us. And I'll come back for the conclusion. So IBM DevOps Automation at the end of 2023 has made a significant announcement and has rebranded and simplified the portfolio. And so now the old rational name is gone, and we have a new DevOps test name for all the test offering. So instead of saying rational test something, we are going to say DevOps test something. Like the test automation server is now the test hub, and the test workbench, that our two main products, is now called the DevOps test workbench. There is a link here to access to the announcement. It's a public page where you can find all the new name for DevOps automation portfolio, because everything has been renamed. So with that new name, we are going to look at the functionality, DevOps Test Workbench, where we create the test, DevOps Test Hub, where we deploy the test on a cloud-native Kubernetes platform. And still, we have the DevOps Test Virtualization, where we can create virtual service to replace a real service. We can have a virtual service. And then the DevOps Test Embedded, that is a little bit different, not connected to the rest of the DevOps test portfolio, but very important to test embedded software and very powerful to do that. It's still around. It's called now DevOps Test Embedded. What we need to tell you also is that all the part numbers say the same. It's just the name that's changed, that is changing. So if you have any license with a rational name, it stays the same, just a new name. When you will install the new version of the product, you will see the new name in the menu, in the structure of the installed software. That's all. If you have any question, please use the chat. Violetta is monitoring the chat for us. We'll be able to answer all the questions. So DevOps Test Hub, what is it? It's the place for collaboration. This is the place where we are actually doing the centralized testing of the enterprise. Before, we were doing the testing on every workbench, on every Eclipse environment, where we were creating the test, we were also running the test. And that was giving us long start time, and that was also a problem for resource in case the test was eating a lot of resources. So now the new approach is to have a centralized server for the enterprise where we are going to run all the tests, API, functional, performance, and also where we are going to run our virtual services. And that server is based on container. So this means that it provides us the scaling that we need for faster testing. So now when we are in test workbench, we are still going to create our test suite and push that into Git. We have um, a specific integration in between test workbench and Git. So you don't have to go into Git to push your test. It will be directly into the workbench where you can interact with Git and push your modification into the Git repository. And then when that's done, we go onto the Devops Test Hub, and there we pull the test and we can then run those tests. And when the test and the test campaigns, the test suite run, then the DevOps Test Hub is going to manage the execution on container and is going to create as many containers as we want, as is needed by the actual test. So very quick and simple deployment, run on Azure Kubernetes services of Amazon, runs on IBM Red Hat OpenShift, runs on Red Hat server and Ubuntu server using Key3s. It's we also have here all the recommended solution of cloud native foundation like Keycloak. That is a very strong security infrastructure to manage the users and authenticate users, because our DevOps Test Hub is secure by design. To be able to access the Test Hub, you have to log in. And then when you are in, you have user permissioning. So depending on what role you have on a project, you will see different things. You will be able to change or not, run or not, just look or make some modification. So DevOps Test Hub comes with a web-based application that is the central location for the collaboration. So the testing activity are structured into team space, projects. All the tests are imported from source control Git. And so it provides all the visibility to all the testing activity of the enterprise into one user console, web console. And then for sure, we can dig into the details of every project. So that centralized application for testing, we can see all the tests, performance, UI, integration, but also external from us that are Postman, GUnit, GMeter, AppScan. Everything can be integrated and drive onto this console. So the principal role of the console is to run, monitor, start, stop, test. But not just that. It's also where we see all the activity and where we see the result. So runs can be scheduled, of course, periodically, and can be run on demand or can be scheduled at a certain moment. So Test Hub is also an open platform, and this is very important. Tests can be run from the console, but also from outside platform like Jenkins, Maven. And we provide GitHub Actions, for instance, that are pre-built. We also provide MS Azure Actions pre-built. So it's very easy to introduce a test into a MS Azure pipeline or a GitHub pipeline. And then we can report into external platform. So our test can be seen from the outside. We can send notification. So all that is happening from the test hub to the outside. And this connection, these configuration are done once, and they are used with all the teams. So that reduce the number of error or parallel connection that could be created by the tester who doesn't know that there is a connection to a resource monitoring or a test defect management already in place, because this is done at the server level, and so it's more secure, and it's less work to be done at the tester level. So we can manage our tests from CI/CD deploy, Devops deploy level, Azure, Jenkins. We can export the data to monitoring to Grafana or outside data export. We can bring in resource monitor, and also we can integrate with test and defect management platform like Jira or X-Ray. And another one is to be able to have direct connection with webhook like Slack or Team, and provide information about execution or result of an execution of a test directly to a team. And on the Devops Test Hub, we have all the information at a glance, where we bring all the tests together, and we have a dashboard to surface all that. So it's central location for reporting. So about the testing capability, so we understand, we said that we can import the open source. We can have UI testing, performance testing, API testing. We can mix those tests to have a compound test approach, where we can have UI testing, performance testing, and API testing all together in a suite, and where we can have logic added to be able to have a real test of a platform that has all those dimensions in it. We can have the virtual services, as I said, and this is where we are going to find the new data fabrication service on this test hub. So what's new in Devops Test 2023.12 now? First, we have this artificial intelligence new function coming with the artificial intelligence into the Devops Test 2023.12. That was a major theme. So first, we are helping the performance tester to understand what is the result of a performance test campaign by giving them some insight that have been defined and feed into the DevOps Test Hub. So now we have a new insight menu on the Test Hub, and as the performance test campaign is analyzed, we provide identification of possible reason of performance test behavior to understand a behavior, like a lockstep. Or second is the AI vision. So based on a model of a user interface, we can start to build tests and not wait until the user interface is ready to be tested to start creating tests. And so we can load the design, then we can use AI and computer vision technique to detect all the objects that are on the design to be able to create the test. And then when we have the user interface and that we can change the test to adapt to the real user interface. That's how we heal the test healing about with the new user interface. So we see here on this little animation how the Test Hub is going to provide us some difference between the actual user interface and the model that we have used to create our test. And we can heal the test, and so we'll be ready to test the user interface much before the user interface, not wait until the user interface is ready to be able to provide a test. So you have a link here that is the recording of the last webinar, where we had a very technical and deep demonstration of this functionality that you can have a look if you want to have more details on this functionality. And to finish is the synthetic data generation. So we have, I'm just going to say that because then Stuart is going to go into the details, but on Devops Test Hub web interface, we now have a new authoring menu where we have access to a new functionality that is create, fabricate, test data. And we will see more and more new functionality arriving on Devops Test Hub as the new release are arriving later this year and next year. So, Stuart, stage is for you. So I have to give you the content.
Yeah. Take over sharing the screen.
Yes. I stop sharing.
All right. Hopefully that has begun. Yeah, I think that started. Perfect. Yeah. All right. So thank you, Muriel, and welcome everybody. So today, as Muriel said, we're going to talk about test data fabrication, or test data, to be more precise. We will focus on test data fabrication, but data has multiple dimensions in test. And again, you'll if you've joined any of our previous webinars, you'll detect a bit of a theme here. We're talking a little bit about the rationale before we go into the product demonstration. And again, talking through the rationale of this particular data fabrication with our team. The problem statement is essentially that test data is one of the biggest challenges in testing, either because it's very difficult to get hold of, or because it's difficult to get the right volumes, or because it needs to be refreshed repeatedly, or because it belongs to multiple different stakeholders, and so on, and so on, and so on. And for, as long as automation has been around, people have developed techniques to manage the need, to manage the ability to get hold of data for testing. And it's not that long since I worked with customers who quite openly and perhaps reluctantly, but openly would take copies of data from production overnight and would use that to play back into their test environments during the following day or following week or whatever it might have been. But these days we can't typically get away with that because we're under a lot more scrutiny, and there are lots more regulations and controls that prevent us from using any sensitive data or any identifying data. And so we need new strategies. We can't just stick with what we've done for decades. And synthetic test data generation is a strategy in terms of being able to synthetically, artificially generate data that is fresh, on demand, and is in the right format and of the right consistency to use in test cases. And it needs to be provided in a way that is plug and play, in a way that can be integrated into whatever process or pipeline or tooling is required. And so what we've built, and what I hope you'll agree you'll see in the demonstration shortly, is a very simple code-free data creation environment. It's not quite an IDE, but you could think of it that way. You're developing models of what your test data should look like, and we're doing so in a way that is reusable, templatized, so that you're not reinventing the wheel every time you have a new project. We want these artifacts to be shareable, and we want you to be able to reuse things and engineer things in a sensible way. If I can get the slide to move on, there we go. So just a quick slide, and then we'll go straight to the demo. What we're showing here is somewhat the workflow, if you like. And in the center of the screen, you'll see this key component here, a data definition. A data definition is essentially something that describes a schema or a structure or a subset of data that is important to you as a tester or otherwise in your environment. And these data definitions are populated through various different means. They can be created manually by hand by a tester or a data engineer, and you'll see me do that shortly. They can be imported through database queries, through data sets, which is a concept in our test hub, and also through things like CSV files. And that's enabling us to create a structure wherein I might say, I have a need for a first name and a last name and a city and an address and so on and so forth. But actually populating that data, typically that's going to come from what we call generators. And generators are built-in capability in the tool to generate data of different types. And you'll see on the screen some basic types there. So an address or an enumerator where I might have a list, a string, a date. And those are dragged and drops and configured in these data definitions. So again, you'll see this in the live demo. The consumption of these data definitions and the output, if you like, is varied depending on the need. So it might be that in some cases you want to create a data set or a CSV file for colleagues, and they need 1,000 records to use for some testing, or they need 1 million customers to test a new mobile device or something like that. Maybe you have some test engines where you're running some UI tests or some performance tests or some API tests. And in the Devops Test Hub, you can directly integrate this test data into those test engines. And you'll see that in the demo. And then lastly, you might have pipelines. You might have CI/CD DevOps pipelines, and you want to be able to call for this data as a part of your pipeline to refresh or to reset or to provide data for what's coming next. So let's have a look at the product, and we'll jump into the Devops test. And I'm sure if you're on this webinar, you've probably seen Devops test before, so I won't give a full orientation or anything like that. I will be jumping around a couple of different screens, but will largely be within the authoring section, because when we're thinking about test data, typically we're thinking about the data assets, and they are assets that we will author in this workbench. So bear with me one moment. What we're going to start by looking at is actually not the synthetic part of data fabrication, but actually test data itself. And in our product, we support all manner of things, one of which is a data set. And as I said before, data sets are something that can be consumed by tests, they can be consumed by users. Ultimately, they are relatively static typically, but we'll come on to talk about more dynamic ones in a second. But some of our users may not be familiar with this capability in Test Hub. There's a full editor for your test data embedded inside Test Hub, so I can add data, edit data, manipulate data, and import it, export it, encrypt it. So what we'll do is we'll actually create a new data set, and we're going to create it for a sort of a fictitious retail website. So we're going to work with some data that we might, for example, use for promotions on a retail website. And I'm going to use an import to pull in some sample data. And I'm going to say that the first row is containing headers so that we've got our column names nicely listed out for us. And what you'll see once the data set gets created is that we have some, what could be considered sensitive data in here. So we've got our description, here's a Valentine's promotion, it's a stackable discount, gives a 10% discount on our website, and here's the code Valentine10. Obviously, these are not sensitive, but if they were, what I might like to do is encrypt this column, mask this column in a way that none of this data should be visible in any of the test reports or in any of the user interfaces that our testers are going to work with. But when we run our test cases, obviously, we'll need to test to make sure that our new customer February code is working. So I can encrypt columns, multiple columns, or just one in my data set, and that will then mask it from view. But then obviously, how can I work with that data if I need to edit it or if I need to run a test that utilizes this content without giving the password to de-encrypt that content? Well, the way to achieve that is by using what we call a security classification. So if I go through to our security tab under our manage, I can create a classification. I'll call this promotions. And to that classification, I can add things that maybe have sensitive data. So maybe I'll be adding secrets, API keys. Maybe I'll be adding database connections, which we'll come on to in a little while. In my case, I'm going to add a data set. And I neglected to save my data set, which is why we don't see it there. But if I save that, and we'll go back to our security promotions classification, and we'll add the data set. Now it's saved. So what I'm doing now is I'm adding the password for that encrypted column into the data set. It doesn't look like I've actually set it correctly. I've probably mistyped the password, bumbling on this keyboard, but you'll be able to use your imagination. If I enter the correct password here that mirrors the password I set on the encrypted column, then that gives me the ability to dictate which users should have access to this sensitive data. And I could come into this view and I could say, well, you know what, I'd like to let Dawn have access to this security classification, which maybe entails several data sets and database connections and maybe some secrets as well. So again, that's not data fabrication in and of itself, but it is a capability of Test Hub, and it is very relevant to data in test and the sensitivity around that. So let's jump from talking about data sets to talking about our generators and the data fabrication. And first thing to show is our catalog. So the catalog is a shared view of all the different data generators that we have in this Test Hub. So there are obviously the basic ones that we ship with the product, and then you can add your own classifications for additional configurations of generators. So here up at the top, for example, if I wanted to generate a date time, we have a date time basic generator, and then I can configure the date time to specify a range, to exclude certain days, to limit from times, to set the pattern, and so on and so forth. If I wanted to use a name generator, well, do I want a title and a first name and a last name? Do I just want a last name? Do I just want a first name? Likewise with a phone number. I can select the format, I can select the country. It's very easy to use these base generators to model and create many, many other generators. So some examples of that would be if I'd like to generate a Visa card, credit card number when I'm testing. So I've got something simplistic that would work, to be validated through form validation. So here I've got a regular expression that's expressing the format for a Visa card number. And we have a helper that can help you to generate regular expressions if you're not familiar with that concept, or if you're not an expert. I certainly am not, and I use that helper all the time. We also have different what we call distributions of data. So here in a very similar generator, what I've done is I've added multiple types of card details. So I've got everything from cash through MasterCard, Amex, and Visa. And I've set a distribution percentage so that when I use this generator in a data definition that we'll come on to talk about, I would expect that at least 60%, or at most 60%, of my credit card numbers would be of type Visa, and 9% would be Amex, and so on and so on. So these generators, these are the things that you will use in your data definitions. So, for example, if I wanted to create a new generator, I might say, well, actually, I've got to run a performance test against our website, and there's a search box, and I want to test that search box. So I want a list of search terms that I can iterate through in a sensible way. So I might put this into my Emerald, because my store is called Emerald category. And when we generate that new generator and put it in a category, it will allow us to configure it, and we can specify the different properties we're interested in. So if we look under Emerald, and I think you might just have to refresh it. This is a development environment I'm working on here, and it isn't the fastest system, so you have to excuse that. So here we're configuring our search terms for web generator. And what I can do is I can say, well, I want two configurations. I'd like to have a furniture category, and maybe I'd like an electronics category. And so the values for furniture might be, I want to search for bed, or maybe desk, and maybe a chair. And the values for electronics, well, perhaps that would be a TV, maybe it would be a laptop, and maybe a mobile phone. And you can see here the distribution currently is set 50-50, but again, I could change that if I wanted to. I'm quite happy with 50-50. For my furniture, I've got a random distribution, so it will randomly select between any of the values in here. It doesn't have to be just 3. I can add another value. Down here on the electronics, perhaps I do want a distribution, and perhaps I want to say, well, actually, I'd like to be 80% of people asking for TVs, and maybe 10% of people asking for laptops and mobile phones. So what that allows us to do is then generate data, and this is just a very simple way of previewing the data in a either random way or in a weighted distribution way. So we should see there are more TVs in this distribution. But again, we'll be distributing 50-50 across the furniture and the electronics. So it's ultimately, the world is your oyster in terms of how many different types of combinations of these generators you can create. And as I said before, there are lots of base generators from using a data set where you might already have reams of data that you want to use, to generating different base types and so on. So let's now move over to thinking about data definitions, where we're going to use these generators. And we'll create a new one. I'll just close these tabs. And we'll call this, let's say user data, for example. I'll select where I want this to go in my project. And then I've got options on how I want to start. I can either start, as we will, with an empty data definition, and I can create it by hand, or I could import from a data set, import from a CSV, or import from a database query. We'll come on to look at those in a sec. So my empty data definition is exactly what you would expect. It's empty, and I can populate the fields, and I can then drag and drop the generators. Just a second. It's the curse of the demo. The environments are always slower when you're running a demo. Great. So here's our new user data definition. And you can see I've got a template here for a field, and I've got my generators over here on the right-hand side, which I can use. So we're going to create something pretty simple. So we're going to have a first name, we'll have a last name, we'll have a phone number, and we'll have an email address. And I can simply drag across from the generators into the configuration. I can click to edit. I can say, well, okay, this is a first name, so I just want first name. For the last name field, again, I'll use a name, but this time I'm going to have a last name. For the phone number, I'll drag and configure it to specify a format. Maybe I want the international symbol. Maybe I want my numbers to come from the UK only, or maybe I want a different distribution of some from the UK, some from the US. And for email, maybe I want to generate an email address from a regular expression, or in my case, I've already got some email addresses. So here I could say, well, I want a random email address. And if we take a look at what that's doing, it's generating a random email address from a pretty basic regular expression. So we'll refine this a little bit, but for now, that looks pretty good. I could use that in my test case. And so I'll take a preview of that data. And so this preview at the bottom is showing me the type of data that would be generated. So we've got Shane Ripple with his phone number from the UK with the +44 dial code and a very random looking email address. And in most cases, that would probably work for the purposes of testing, because who's validating the actual email addresses. But we might want to be a little bit more specific about these email addresses. So maybe we'll say, well, actually, we want to reference the first name and the last name inside the email address. So here we've got a slightly different generator, a function generator this time. And again, this is really easy to use. All the fields and properties and the different functions are in here. I can just drag them into my expression, but I'm essentially concatenating the first name that we generate and the last name we generate with mycompany.com. I could, of course, generate that too. If we preview now, we'll see we've got Crespin Lovell, first and last name, and the email address is crespinlovell@mycompany.com. So again, super simple. There's no real code to write. Of course, you need to manipulate that configuration, and sometimes it's easier to do that with a little bit of function, but it's not anything too taxing. So how could I then use this data? Well, of course, if I save it, I might want to generate 100 records or 1 million records or whatever it might be. So the preview is all well and good, but actually when I want to use the data, I want to export it. So perhaps I want 100 rows of user data. Maybe I want to include the headers, maybe I don't. Maybe I want to seed it. This is optional. If you don't seed the generation, then you will get completely random data. If you do seed it, then the next time you come to run your test, you can reference that same seed value, and you can set whatever seed you want, 1, 2, 3, 4. You will end up with the same data because we'll seed it in exactly the same way. So I can then download that data. And again, I've done something wrong. I've referenced the wrong file name or something like that, but it downloads the data and you can then hand that off to your teams, or you can load it into some other system. But I said before, there are multiple ways to consume this data. And one is, of course, exporting it. Another is passing it to your test engines. So if we jump over from our authoring perspective into the execution perspective, where we would typically run our tests, and obviously there are lots of different types of tests we have in the server. But here I've got a compound test suite that's going to register some users in my system. Well, this test, this UI test in this case, this uses test data. And it typically would use a CSV file, so it would use some very static data. But if I have already run a phase of testing and we found some kind of a bug and I want to run this test again, well, I can't re-register the same users in the system without doing a full system refresh or reset. So rather than do that, I probably would change my test data to register some different users. And I could do that by selecting a different CSV file. So maybe I'll use this large static data set that we had loaded earlier, or users set 2. But in our case, I'm more likely wanting to use our synthetic generation engine, so our user, and I want to say, maybe there's 10 rows of data I want, and maybe there is, the seed value 1, 2, 3, 4, because I want to use that same data, or maybe I want completely random fresh, in which case I can select that. So multiple ways to consume that data, as I said. Now, if we go back to our data perspective in the authoring tab, this is clearly a very, very simple example of a data definition, just 4 fields. But in some cases, that's going to be useful and relevant. In a more realistic example, you can have more data, and the generators are going to be slightly richer in terms of what sort of data they're generating. And you're going to need to start to think about distribution and alignment of data across your data definition, across your exportable data. So here I've got an example for a retail store that we have called Emerald, and we use it for a lot of our demonstrations. And if I were to process an end-to-end transaction, going through the search facility, adding a product to a cart, checking it out, adding all my payment details, this data definition contains all the data I would need to be able to do that. So I've got, first name and last name and an address and all those usual things. I've got things like an address nickname, because in our tool, I can add multiple addresses. So I've got a nice list here of nicknames of products. I've got a company name generator, which is pulling from a data set, a CSV file that contains maybe 1,000 different company names. So we can populate those pretty randomly. We've got some dates, and we've got our payment card types. And as you saw before, the payment card type was interesting because we've got this distribution of different card types: Visa, MasterCard, Amex, and cash. But we've got 2 fields that relate to the card type. We've got the payment card type itself, and then we've got the card number. And in order to generate a card number for Visa, we know that we should have a character beginning with a 4, and a MasterCard, it should begin with a 5 or a 2. So if we were to generate this data and it wasn't aligned correctly, we would end up with random data. It would be the Visa card payment card type, but we might then enter a payment card number which looks more like an Amex card, and it may fail form validation in your website. So by using this distribution and the alignment of the percentages equivalent across multiple fields, what happens when we preview the data is we ensure that there is consistency and alignment across the different columns. So where I see Visa, or where I see Amex or MasterCard or cash, I will see an appropriate value. It really looks like this server is having a bit of a time of it. It's a shared server, and quite often people are very busy on it. So that's my fault for borrowing a server rather than having my own. So here we go. So we've got a Visa credit card here, and obviously it matches that pattern. We've got a MasterCard here, and it matches either the 2, or in other cases it would match the 5, and so on and so on. So they're really quite powerful in terms of the ways you can start to use that. So moving on to things that we are, everything you've seen so far is in the product. You can use it today in Test Hub version 11. I'm now going to move to show you something that's going to be released in version 11.1 or 11.01, I think it will be called, very soon. So that you don't have very long to wait for this at all. And it's going to give you an indication of where we're taking this functionality over the course of the rest of this year. And you'll see very quick evolution of this. So we're starting to work with databases because, of course, a lot of our data is in databases. A lot of the test or use cases for test data involve seeding data into use cases or pulling data from databases. And so the ability to, first of all, connect to databases of all types is important. And you'll recognize that previously the passwords we were able to store in those data security classifications. So again, this is nice and secure. You can control who has access to perform these database actions and who doesn't. And so the sort of the core asset that we're going to relate here is what we call a database query. And let's call this our employee for argument's sake. And we're going to locate it again in our data folder in our project. And this will create us a blank database query that we can then populate with a connection, first of all. So our connection, we're going to use Oracle. And we can select a table. So you'll see all the different tables populated here. We're going to work with employees. And maybe what I'd like is to pull some data, the first name and the last name, and the the manager ID from the database. So if I preview that, these are the 3 columns. This is the data I would have got back if I used this in a generator. We'll come on to that in a sec. So I can pick and choose whatever columns and whatever tables I want to use, but I can also employ, rather than a visual approach to this, if I'm familiar with SQL, or if my colleagues are able to give me some SQL queries, then you can actually write the code. And that's somewhat interesting, but why would you do that when I can say select first name from employees, or I can go back to the visual approach and I can say click the checkbox. Well, that becomes interesting when you start thinking about joining data across tables. So in my database, I don't just have a single table for employee that I'm interested in. I want to be able to form a single data set from my employees table, where I've got their first and last name and so on, but also their jobs title, which is in a different table, jobs, and their department name, which is in a different table called departments. And so I can create these SQL joins, and I can preview that data so that we've now got all of those columns across multiple tables. And once I save it, I can then either generate a data definition, or I can generate a data set, which is probably more visually appealing to create right now. So if I were to do that, we'll say we'd like to start, rather than with an empty data set and manually create it, or fabricating data from our data definition. In this case, I want to use my database query. I'll select the query that we just created. So that's going to be this employee query once it loads. It's taking a second. There we go. And I'll say, I want 100 rows of data. And hey presto, we've got now some test data that we could desperately easily plug into our test engine or into our pipeline, or we could share with colleagues. Not only that, but this test data can be refreshed on demand through that database query if we want to produce fresh data from that database. And of course, you can then go in and you can encrypt the data like we did before, and you can share it in any way you like. So that's a very quick guided tour of some of the data concepts in Test Hub, focusing on test data fabrication. Hopefully that was insightful for you. Hopefully you can see where we're starting to take this into a more sort of database-oriented space, where we'll start seeing new functionality to let you seed a database with data from one of your database generators rather than just pulling data. We'll also push data into those databases. And in a similar way to what we did with our data alignment and distribution, we'll also give you a way to make sure that your data is referentially intact in your databases, because of course you'll have things like foreign key constraints, and you'll have rules around ratios of data. If we have 4 departments, then I want approximately somewhere between 10 and 30 employees per department, for example. So all of that's coming. Watch this space. But for now, I'll hand you back to Muriel, and thank you for attending. Muriel, over to you.
Yeah. So thank you very much for this presentation, Stuart. It was really interesting. I just want to say one thing for the conclusion about, where we are coming and where we are, what we are doing right now, where work was done locally, and now we have a real collaboration platform, but where we see new functionality arriving at every release. But more importantly is the future of our product is to really go into UI modernization. And so we are going to see more and more authoring tools out of Eclipse-based look that we have today with those heavy desktop clients. And we will have more authoring environment into modern browser or Visual Studio Code. So I just want to tell you that we have an IBM software delivery survey for 2024, where you can interact, answer questions, and influence the roadmap. So please take 3 minutes to answer to that survey, so we can have your feedback and use it for the future of the product. That's all for today. If you have any question, we are here to answer in the chat window. And if not, then thank you very much for your attention. And thanks, Stuart, for the nice presentation. I do not see any new question.
No, I can't see any questions, Muriel. But obviously, if there are any come in as we're ending the call, we can always pick them up and respond offline.
Yes. Oh,
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you, Muriel. Appreciate it. And,
Yes, thank you, Stuart, and thank you everybody for your attention, and we can resume.